Hi everyone, and welcome to the presentation on Africa, a journey through time. My name is William Cooper, and I'm the grandson of Frida Cooper, who was an Amica resident that passed away on July 7th, 2 years ago. I missed her, but I'm making my monthly presentation at Amica in her honor. Today we are finishing our travels to Afro-Eurasia. Afro-Eurasia covers 57% of the world's land area, whereas 86% of its population. We started in the Middle East, then visited Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, East Asia, North Asia and Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Northern Europe, and today we visit Africa. Bon voyage. As this is our final visit to Afro-Eurasia, next month we begin our travels outside of Afro-Eurasia by visiting Oceania, then South America, Central America, Mexico, the US, and Canada. Before we start, Africa has 54 countries. It is the second largest continent by size and by population. Today we're going to cover also 7 main colonizers that are listed here, and the main story of how they were colonized, how they were decolonized, and how Africa is doing today. Also, we have to accept that one country is transcontinental, Egypt, because when we visited the Middle East, we saw Egypt as well, due to the fact that the Sinai Peninsula, seen here in red, is part of the Middle East. Now let's begin. There are 9 sections to today's presentation. Firstly, ancient Africa. We begin with the importance of Africa. Africa had several key civilizations, including ancient Egypt and Sudan, that shaped global culture, science, governance, religion, and politics. The birth of ancient Egypt. Without the Nile River, ancient Egypt would have been a dry wasteland with little to no population. Even today, if you look at a light map of Egypt, you will see that almost all the population lives along the Nile, most of the habitable area. So in 3100 BCE, King Narmer united the early communities, starting the first dynasty. We have the Great Pyramid of Giza that was constructed during this time by Pharaoh Khufu during the Old Kingdom, and it's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, still standing here after almost 5,000 years, built out of 2 million limestone blocks. Rob Armstrong asks, did aliens build the Great Pyramid of Giza? Now Rob, this is a very popular conspiracy theory. However, we know that 20,000 to 30,000 humans built it over the course of 20 years. And we know this because there are worker diaries and the sheds that they lived in. And we know that they used simple tools, sledges, and ramps. So it seems incredibly difficult that it's still standing here after 4,500 years, and how it's even aligned to true north using star observations, but we know that they were not aliens who built it. During this time, the Sphinx was built by Pharaoh Khafre from a single limestone bridge, and it's meant to represent a human's head and a lion's body, so strength out of the lion and wisdom from the human. The invention of hieroglyphs happened during this time as well, and this was ancient Egypt's alphabet, and it's still found in ancient temples and scrolls. So for example, this is how you can translate it, with A as a bird, B as a leg, and D as a hand. So this was how they would communicate. The ancient Egyptians loved the art of mummification, preserving bodies by first wrapping them in a layer of salt, in cotton, or in some kind of textile, and then encasing them. And this is how they would preserve them along with their artifacts, food, so that they would go with these things to the afterlife. Because they thought that whatever you would bury with, you would go with into the next life. Cleopatra VII was Egypt's final ruler. Now you may think that she was either dark-skinned or Arab, but actually she was white, born into a Greek Macedonian dynasty in 69 BCE. In 48 BCE, she formed an alliance with Julius Caesar, securing her the throne. And 7 years later, she joined Mark Antony in his eastern campaigns. But then here was her downfall, because in 31 BCE, she was defeated by Octavian at the Battle of Actium, and Antony died soon after. Then, a year later, facing Roman conquest, she died, and Egypt was taken over by the Romans, becoming their richest province. Carthage. Now, Carthage was North Africa's naval power because of its prime location in North Africa and controlling parts of Iberia. It was ruled by Hannibal as its main leader. Now, it was a powerful city-state that had several conflicts with Rome, known as the Punic Wars, that shaped Western history. It lost the final one in 146 BCE and was taken over by Rome. Section 2, Medieval Africa. Now, this was a time of great empires and flourishing cities such as Ghana, Songhai, and Mali that shaped West Africa. Exploration and colonization. Now, in the 1400s, exploration began around the world to travel and explore the New World. But specifically in the late 1800s and the 1880s, there was an event called the Scramble for Africa, where there was a conference and 7 main colonizers decided to start colonizing Africa. The first one that we're talking about is the UK. Now, they controlled all these countries here in purple. It was the largest empire ever in history, ruling so many states, focusing on trade routes, raw materials, and settler colonies, such as South Africa. These were some of these white dominions, for example, in Canada, in Australia, where they would get thousands and millions of settlers to live there. In 1882, they took over the Suez Canal in Egypt, the gateway to India. During this time, without using the Suez Canal, you would have to travel from the Mediterranean all around Africa to get to India. So now this gateway to India would make this trip 7,000 kilometers shorter. But then, the UK wanted to control this gateway to India, so they seized it from Egypt, sparking Egyptian nationalism. Nigeria was Britain's colonial giant because it was its most populous colony, and today in Africa, it is the most populated country, rich in oil and people. Kenya was known for having tons of coffee and tea plantations, so Britain, who was focused on the raw materials, of course wanted to seize this territory. Ghana was known for gold and cocoa, becoming a hub for British trade. And South Africa was where the empire met apartheid. Here there were several conflicts with the Dutch, called the Boer Wars. The Boers were the Dutch settlers, and in here, Britain was able to win and control South Africa. They had a system called apartheid, which would divide areas based on European use and less areas for black people, although they were the majority population. Uganda was known for their massive coffee and cotton plantations. And Zimbabwe, formerly known as Rhodesia, named after the Brit Cecil Rhodes, where white settlers declared unilateral independence to resist the black majority. France. Now, France controlled all these territories here in blue, and Muslims to this day are still considered Francophone nations, which means that they speak French. They tried to directly assimilate Africans into the French culture and values, and oftentimes they viewed their colonies as no longer overseas territories, but part of the French government family. So they were very close to their colonies, especially Algeria, that we'll talk about soon. Now with Algeria, they had over 1 million European settlers in here, as it was very easy to originally govern the colony, as it was so close to France at the top of northern Africa. And Senegal was known for being the classroom of the colonies because Dakar became the administrative capital of French West Africa, having incredible French universities. and the Ivory Coast, now known as Côte d'Ivoire, which is its name in French, was a major cocoa and coffee exporter. And Madagascar and Djibouti. The latter of these is my favorite African country, as you can probably see why, Djibouti. And these were strategic outposts for France, because if you look at a map, Djibouti is over there and Madagascar is there. So with Djibouti, its prime Red Sea axis made it a hotspot for trade. And still to this day, many large countries have Red Sea bases in there. In 1912, Morocco became a French protectorate, with Spain controlling two smaller zones, one in the south and one in the north. France held the real power, although it kept the Sultan as a figurehead, and this system lasted until Morocco's independence in 1956. Belgium. Now with Belgium, they controlled the Congo, as well as later on Rwanda and Burundi. Now here, Congo was not a Belgian colony at first. It was actually privately owned by their king, Leopold II. Now what happened here was really disgusting, because he claimed that he was civilizing the country, but instead he created a system of forced labor and terror that killed millions. So in 1908, after sparking global outrage, the Belgian government had to take direct control away from the king. They put profits over people because Congo was known for having incredible rubber resources. So rubber quotas were enforced by mutilation, hostage taking, and killings that ultimately killed millions. And this became a global scandal. Rwanda and Burundi. So these countries were actually originally owned by Germany, but we'll talk about that in a second, but then they were divided in half by Belgium, creating the roots of a future genocide. Germany. Now with Germany, they controlled all these countries here in mint green, including Rwanda and Burundi that they formerly owned. But they lost all their colonies after World War I to Britain, France, and Belgium. Namibia is where the first genocide of the century happened, as the Herero and Nama tribes were almost decimated. Portugal. Now Portugal controlled these countries here, but their two biggest colonies were Mozambique and Angola. They were the ones to hold onto their colonies for the longest period, only giving independence after their 1974 revolution that created democracy in Portugal. Spain. Now we talked about Morocco before, but here we can see what Spain controlled in Morocco, the southern part and the northern part. The southern part is known as Western Sahara, and the northern part is Merida and Ceuta. And Spanish remains the official language in Equatorial Guinea to this day. So although Morocco received its full independence in 1956, this did not include the territories that Spain owned, because the southern part, which was inhabited by the indigenous Sahrawi people, became called Western Sahara and was still kept on by Spain. So with Western Sahara, it was declared a colony by Spain in 1884, rich in phosphate deposits, and as I talked about, its indigenous Sahrawi people was mostly ignored or militarily controlled. Now with Equatorial Guinea, it gained its independence peacefully in 1968, and later on, oil was discovered, making it one of Africa's richest per capita. Italy. Now Italy was motivated by trade, resources, and religious missions in particular, trying to convert the continent into Catholicism. And one of their main colonies was Libya. Now here, it's very interesting how, if you think about it, Italy could have caused World War I. As we know, the Balkan Wars were one of the causes behind World War I. And this happened because after Italy took Libya from the Ottomans, the Balkans saw how weak the Ottomans were. So they decided to start fighting them. And this was a cause behind World War I. So if you think about it, Italy taking Libya was one of those main causes. the lasting impacts of colonization. Now, firstly, we have exploitation and division, because Africa is rich in resources and minerals that the Europeans obviously exploited. They also created arbitrary borders, dividing people, tribes, and cultures. And this is how, between 33 years, a continent can go from being mostly independent and mostly tribal, with a couple of colonies and some territory owned by the Ottomans. Some 33 years later, almost all controlled by colonies, specifically France and UK. We also have the transatlantic slave trade that devastated West and Central America by tearing apart families. On this map, we can see how millions of people were sent to South America, primarily Brazil, the Caribbean, the US, some to northern parts of Africa, some to the Middle East, and even a couple 100,000 people directly to Europe. We also talked about the Suez Canal in a part about the UK, but here's a little bit more background on it. It was opened in 1869, linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Built by the French in Egypt, it was under Ottoman rule because the Ottomans controlled Egypt. Now the Brits have you talked about seasons because they want to control that global hotspot of trade. The World Wars, World War I. So as we all know by now, there were 6 main causes. European expansionism, the Serbs wanting independence and control of Bosnia, France Ferdinand's assassination and Russia's defense of Serbia, interlocking alliances, creating the Allies and the Central Powers, Germany's support of Austria, and the German people's support of participating in the war. Now, what did Africa do in World War I? 2 million Africans served in this war, in several key battle zones, fighting for the empires that ruled them. Here's a map of the different parties in World War I, the Allies in blue and the Central Powers in orange. Now, I show this because this is how Africa was divided by colonies. All the colonizers, except for Germany, who was shown in orange in Africa, controlled the continent. So, Africa was primarily part of the Allies. Post-World War I. There were also six treaties signed, but for today, the Treaty of Versailles with Germany is the most important. Now, this is because, as I alluded to, all of German Africa went to the French, the British, and the Belgian after World War I, because the League of Nations granted them this territory. We also have the rise of Pan-Africanism, represented by this symbol here, that emphasizes the shared history and solidarity of people of African descent. But also, colonial economies crashed because of the Great Depression, weakening European control over Africa. And also, nationalist and communist ideas began to spread in urban centers, intensifying the need for independence. World War II. Now, in World War II, Africa was strategically important because it controlled the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. So Axis and Allied powers fought for controlling the continent. Over 1 million Africans fought in this war, recruited from all these different colonies serving around the world. The war weakened European control over African colonies as the veterans came home demanding rights and respect, and this sparked anti-colonial movements. So as I showed in World War I, this is the map of World War II, the Allies of the Axis. And here, since Italy was on the side of the Axis, and Germany had lost all of its territory, Africa was almost all Allied. Post-World War II. Now, after World War II, there was the spirit of decolonization. So Section 4, decolonization. So the winds of change began to happen after World War II because European markets were decimated. They had spent all their money on this war and had no more power and resources to control the continent. So this led to nationalist leaders, ideas, and protests. We begin with the UK, And Britain's African empire began to crumble after World War II. But they favored gradual handovers with constitutions and elections. So the two models of diplomacy were found in Ghana and Nigeria, where independence was given slowly but diplomatically, and only in Nigeria there was a small civil war afterwards. In Kenya, there was the Mau Mau Rebellion, an 8-year-long war that resulted in British resistance and conflict. And in 1963, Kenya finally got its independence. The legacy of this is the Commonwealth of Nations that was created, and many African states are part of this, and as well as Canada. The Suez Canal, we talked about it twice, but in 1956, Egypt nationalized it, sparking the Suez Crisis, where Britain, France, and Israel invaded, but Egypt ward them off, and they had to leave. And today, 12% of the world's trade happens through this canal. And one ship in 2021, known as the Ever Given ship, in the middle of the pandemic, almost stopped all this trade, as was stuck for several days. France. Now with France, as we talked about it, they controlled most of West and Central Africa through direct assimilation. So we have Senegal, Ivory Coast, and others who gained independence in 1960. 1960 was known as the Year of Africa because so many countries received their independence. Algeria. Algeria was one of France's closest colonies, and they did not even view it as a colony. They viewed it as a part of the country. So, in 1954, when Algeria wanted independence, an 8-year-long war broke out. So the 1 million European settlers were fighting the Algerians because they wanted to remain a part of France. This resulted in the Evian Accords of 1962, where Algeria was finally granted its independence. The legacy of France is arguably bigger than most of the other colonies combined, because of what is called France d'Afrique, the French military presence that resulted in most countries still using the franc, 21 of them speaking French, and the French government being part of many African institutions. Belgium. Now with Belgium, in 1960, they rushed Congo's independence, leading to an influx of power vacuum, because no African leaders were actually trained for running the country. So the prime minister was assassinated and dictatorship began. The legacy of this is that the Belgian retreat left weak institutions and a very unstable country. But also Rwanda and Burundi would receive their independence in 1962, again sparking the roots of genocide. Germany. Now Germany's rule was short, brief, but the scars are still seen today because of the Herero and Nama genocide, as well as several other atrocities that happened. The legacy of this is that Namibia actually remained part of South Africa until 1990. Portugal. Now Portugal was the last to decolonize, so its colonies received independence in 1974 after the military coup. Now with Angola and Mozambique, there were several civil wars on different fronts that resulted in them eventually getting their independence. And the legacy of this is that Portugal remains the official languages of 6 African nations. Spain. Now with Spain, they gave Equatorial Guinea independence quietly in 1968 with very little resistance. But then, back to Morocco. So with Western Sahara, the southern part of Morocco, the war has never really ended. After Spain withdrew in 1975, Morocco and Mauritania on the right invaded, despite the Sahrawi people wanted independence. This caused the Polisario Front to be still fighting to this day for Western Sahara independence. The legacy of this is that Western Sahara still remains undisputed territory, and Equatorial Guinea still speaks Spanish. Italy. Now with Italy, after 1941, Italy really had no power in Africa because this is when Benito Mussolini's dream of controlling the world had really ended. So, Libya was the first to be free. And legacy of this is that Italian is still used in elite circles of these two countries, but also the Italian architecture is still seen as well. The Cold War era. Now, Africa was sandwiched between two Cold War giants, the Soviets and the Americans. So they had to decide what superpower to support. This caused the US and the Soviets seeing Africa as a battleground for influence. So, the US backed pro-Western regimes and the Soviets backed socialist communist regimes. They competed for loyalty, but also turned Africa into a battlefield by assassinating and installing new leaders. This caused an ideological tug of war, as billions of foreign aid went directly to military regimes, despite the people's need for support. This caused a legacy of instability with many different civil wars and coups that resulted in several governments being changed very, very briefly. And people are still feeling the effects of the Cold War because past alliances have shaped how Africa deals with China and the West. The Rwandan genocide. Now, we mentioned this a couple of times in the part about colonization, but essentially, Belgians loved having these identity cards that would show what tribe people belong to. So they were Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa, and this resulted in several conflicts. The Tutsi minority was favored by the Belgians. So when the Hutu majority independence rule began, there were decades of anti-Tutsi discrimination, and this caused a 3-year-long civil war. The result of this was 100 days of genocide after the president's assassination, where militias and armed civilians began mass killings. Almost a million Tutsi were killed, which was 75% of that tribe's population. Section 6, Nelson Mandela. Now, he was born in 1918 in Eastern Cape because Cape Town was one of the cities in British South Africa. He was given the nickname Nelson by a teacher and fled an arranged marriage in the 40s, so he arrived in Johannesburg. He saw what apartheid was and how discriminated it was towards the African majority. So he joined the African National Congress, ANC, in 1944 and co-founded the Youth League. Here are two examples of what apartheid would look like. So divisions between European areas and African areas. And this caused his peaceful protest era, where he had to lead non-violent campaigns as the ANC was now banned and focused on strategic sabotage. In 1960, there was the Sharpeville massacre, killing almost 70 people, and then the ANC was banned. He helped create a group called the Spear of a Nation, focusing on sabotaging infrastructure, avoiding the loss of life. His prison years. Now, he was captured and tried for treason and sabotage, and delivered his famous "I am prepared to die" speech. He was sentenced to life in prison in 1964. He spent 18 years on Robben Island doing hard labor, often in isolation, and survived harsh conditions. He was transferred to 2 other prisons, but then world pressure began to intensify, with the Free Mandela chant becoming a global saying. There were talks between the governments, so in 1990 he was free, and the world watched in awe. He called for peace and reconciliation over revenge, and negotiated with President F.W. de Klerk, and they both received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993. A year later, it was South Africa's first free and fair vote, and he was elected South Africa's first black president. He created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to help fight back against the decades of apartheid. And actually, Canada has one of the same, focused on reconciliation with the indigenous people. His global legacy. Now he retired in 1999, but continued working for his Nelson Mandela Foundation. He died in 2013 at the age of 95, and over 90 world leaders attended his funeral. Section 7, Africa Today. Here's a snapshot. Rob Armstrong asks, please tell us about the largest African countries in terms of their economy, population, geography, and languages. Now firstly, here's a snapshot of these countries. We can see the capital city, population size, GDP, and GDP per capita. We have Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, the Congo, Kenya, and Morocco. So, in the capital cities in order are Abuja, Pretoria, Cairo, Addis Ababa, Kinshasa, Nairobi, and Rabat. Nigeria has the largest population by far, double that of Egypt, and Congo is the largest by size. Nigeria has the highest GDP, but the highest GDP per capita belongs to South Africa. Africa's population is 60% under the age of 25, making it the youngest continent, and urbanization is booming, specifically in Lagos, Cairo, and Kinshasa. It is a continent of contrast because you can have so many different landscapes, from the largest desert, second largest rainforest, to beaches. It is full of politics, power, and potential because firstly it has the African Union that brings together all these countries for diplomacy, development, and peace, but also there is a rising young African movement focused on democracy. Here are the main faiths of the continent. So its two largest faiths are Islam and Christianity, but it also has many indigenous tribes with their own religions and traditions. There's a large economic tug of war because Africa holds 30% of the world's mineral reserves. And while poverty persists, countries like Rwanda, Ghana, and Kenya, specifically Rwanda is where tons of modern buildings like this are being built, they are growing fast in tech and services. Amazing Africans. So firstly, we have Mansa Musa, arguably the world's richest man, and now worth of almost $100 trillion. We have Wangari Maathai, the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize for planting over 50 million trees. And this is part of an effort to stop the Sahara because every year the Sahara is expanding further into sub-Saharan Africa. So people are planning to build a massive Great Green Wall with billions of trees to stop its expansion. We have Aliko Dangote, Africa's richest person. And of course, Elon Musk, who you either love or hate, but he was born in Pretoria, South Africa in 1971, and today he's the CEO of Tesla, SpaceX, and Neuralink. Special sites. Africa has Victoria Falls in Zambia and Zimbabwe, Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, Africa's tallest mountain at almost 6,000 meters. The Serengeti National Park in Tanzania that hosts the Great Migration with 2 million wildebeest, zebras, and gazelles. And where you can see animals like bees and like bees. Famous foods. Now Africa has jollof rice, tagine, mafe, injera, which I've had and is delicious, and bunny chow, which is actually not made out of rabbits, but instead it's a kind of curry. global relations and BRICS. China's Belt and Road in Africa, opportunity or overreach. Now, most likely you know what it is, but what is it? It was launched in 2013 by Xi Jinping of China as a global infrastructure strategy to improve trade and connectivity. It's kind of seen as a modern Silk Road, connecting China by road and by maritime projects to different countries, including Turkey, African countries, Pakistan, and even Germany and Italy. Some key projects have included a Kenyan railway, a Djibouti port, and Nigeria's deep sea port. The economic benefits are to boost connectivity, but also to encourage foreign direct investments. But the problem is the debt traps. Now, China is not just building these ports for free, they are loans, so African countries have to pay them back. And the problem is that these loans are often so high that it is impossible to pay them back. So if you can't, China seizes them for a 99-year-long lease. So technically, for example, in Sri Lanka, a port was taken over by China, and now it is owned by China. So African countries have to be wary of this danger. There have been mixed results, as these projects are sleek but financially unsustainable, and some countries have been pulled out of using the BRI. From a geopolitical angle, from 1980 to 2018, the US is losing soft power and trade influence, because as you can see on this map, almost everything was blue in 1980, but now almost everything is red and closer to China, because China is funding more initiatives like these. Also, in 2018, China hacked the African Union headquarters. They had actually built this for Africa, but for 5 years they were daily data transfers, sending information from Africa to Shanghai. Bill Gates has been incredibly involved in Africa, helping out in healthcare with vaccines, malaria, and HIV/AIDS, and also his work has saved millions and millions of lives. But also BRICS includes South Africa, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But today, it actually has even more countries, newly named BRICS Plus. Section 8, Inequality and Power. Look at these two different cities in South Africa. One on the left, one on the right. This one is incredibly wealthy, and this one is a slum. Wouldn't you be surprised that this is different sides of the same road? And that is how unequal South Africa is. In South Africa, the top 10% own 85% of the wealth. And it's all about history because apartheid's shadow is still seen. And finally, section 9, fun facts. Here we have Lucy, the 3.2 million-year-old human skeleton found in 1974 in Ethiopia, which helps us visualize what ancient humans look like. We have the largest hot desert in the world, which is bigger than the entire continental US. Bling and blood, because Africa supplies over half of the world's diamonds, but many of them have been named blood diamonds as they funded African wars. East Africa is actually splitting away from the rest of Africa, not politically, but actually geographically, because in a couple of million years, bye-bye East Africa, hello new coastline, because it's going to look like this. Look at this $100 trillion note from Zimbabwe. During their inflationary crisis, under the horrible leadership of Robert Mugabe, this note was issued. And at one point, it was worth less than a piece of toilet paper. And people actually had to spend their money as fast as possible because by the next day, it could have half the value. did you know that hippos kill more people than lions every year? So it's really hypocrisy. Now, as we all know, ancient Egyptians loved preserving bodies in mummies, but in the 1800s, Europeans looted them, and some were even sold to be eaten as medicine, because they thought that 4,000-year-old bodies had some nutritional value. Africa has over 2,000 languages. Nigeria alone, 500. So every month when I talk about the butterflies, I can't possibly give you 2,000, so today I'll give you 5. We have Swahili, Kipepo, Arabic, Farasha, English and French because they were colonizers, butterfly and papillon, and finally Hausa, Turan, Tunsu. Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for attending. Are there any questions?
Speaking of Africa,
Yes.
that was done in Rift Valley, wasn't it?
Yes, East African Rift, yes. It's all based on everything changing. Any questions?
There is one very small country in Africa that you didn't mention. It's gotten a lot of publicity and
Pasquatini?
Qatar.
Qatar's in the Middle East. It's in the Arabian Peninsula, in Dubai and the Saudi area. Yeah.
But isn't it the coast of Africa?
No, so it's in the Arabian Peninsula. So maybe I'll go back to one of the first.
That would be Africa, that's the Middle East.
But it's part of that? The
No,
country?
it's not part of Africa. Do these maps show it? So the most northern part of Africa is Egypt. However, over here, it's the Arabian Peninsula, and part of that is Qatar.
It was just sure. I'll look at it. Okay.
Yeah, but it has been in a lot of news recently. Any questions? Are we all good?
Thank you. It's a lot of very
Thank you.
good information.
Thank you.
I wonder
It's a very interesting continent, yeah.